I spoke last week about busyness and about happiness. And happiness in relation to a purpose, a transcendent purpose. And then I sent you a message, and it was a digital message in 2 iterations. And the message was about the world and the state of the Jewish world. And what I'd like to do is read a pivotal paragraph from what I wrote, and then pivot in a different direction. I arrive at these high holy days with the regrettable realization that while I don't see any real and concerning anti-Semitism in our local valleys or our city, I do see a return of anti-Semitism to many parts of the world today. A complex anti-Semitism that includes Holocaust denial, the demonization of Jews, the return in modern guises of the blood libel, that ancient, pernicious, fallacious belief that we Jews use the blood of non-Jewish children to make our matzah and at Purim hamantashen. The resurgence of another famous but seemingly unstoppable lie called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. An attempt in Europe to ban circumcision and kosher ritual slaughter, in effect making the practice of traditional Judaism impossible in some European countries today. Not to mention the anti-Zionism that leads otherwise good and decent people to call into question Israel's right to exist. There are 109 nations in the world, 56 Muslim nations, there's 1 Jewish country. And every day, we and the representatives of that country have to defend its right to exist. That this should have happened within living memory of the Holocaust is almost unbelievable. I want to tell you another story about another era. And it's an era of the late 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century in Europe, in a section of Europe, a path through Ukraine and Russia and Poland that came to be known as the Pale of Settlement. Think Fiddler on the Roof, but without the melodies. The Pale of Settlement was a place of great trials and great suffering for the Jewish people. The Pale of Settlement was a place of illness, of poverty, of isolation, of deprivation, and of pogroms. And pogroms, I think we often hear the word, we know what Holocaust is because we've seen videos and images, but a pogrom, you have to look into books to find what it was, what those experiences were for the Jewish people. And my aim tonight and my responsibility to you tonight isn't to describe those vicious attacks on Jewish men and women and children, those towns, those villages in detail of any kind, but instead to ask you to look at what is mythic about it. Not mythic meaning untrue, mythic meaning true over and over again in Jewish history, the myth that repeats and repeats and repeats, that which is repeated in human stories and in human history. And at the same time of all of this suffering in the Pale of Settlement, there was a movement born called Hasidism. The Baal Shem Tov was the founder, and Baal Shem Tov dreamed of and came up with an innovation in Judaism. It was simplicity. It was the poor man's Judaism, the man who couldn't read, the man who didn't have erudition in Talmud. The Baal Shem Tov in Hasidism said it was okay. It was a simple man's or woman's ability to pray with God, to be, to convene, to commune, to sing, to dance, to realize what it meant to be a poor, struggling people, but not alone. The grandson of the Baal Shem Tov was Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, hopefully a familiar name. And he lived a short life, less than 40 years, but in that life he gave us a wealth of wisdom. And one of the things that he gave that kids, Jewish kids from summer camps know is one phrase, or 2 phrases in Hebrew and in English. Kol ha'olam kulo gesher tzar me'od, ve'haikar lo lefached klal. If it's familiar, because it went something like this. Kol ha'olam kulo, gesher tzar me'od, gesher tzar me'od, gesher tzar me'od. כל העולם כולו גשר צר מאוד, Gesher tsar me'od. And then when you were in camp, you would explode in volume and bang on the table saying, Ve'ha'ikar lo lefached klal. Kol ha'olam kulo, Reb Nachman said, all the world is a very narrow bridge. Ve'ha'ikar, and the essence is not to fear at all. Lo lefached klal. But is that possible? Is it possible to live in this world without fearing at all? Is that realism? Can we stand under a cold shower and not feel the cold? Can we walk on hot coals and not feel the heat? Apparently so. What Rabbi Nachman was saying was not to be consumed by fear. A friend of mine, a rabbi in the Bronx, Rabbi Barry Katz, my old roommate in India, after an attack on his synagogue, wrote about these words that he also sang in camp. He said, I never thought much about that until now. Is the main thing not to be afraid at all? Is that Rabbi Nachman's advice? I don't think so, he says. I believe what he meant was don't let fear be everything. Don't let it paralyze you. Don't let it take over. Have you ever held that in your heart? Have you ever held on to that idea that you can be concerned but not consumed? That you can be concerned but not consumed? That you can be larger than your fears and not let them overtake you and overcome you and become you? I remember 9/11. I remember being consumed by fear, being overcome by fear, almost paralyzed by fear. I remember talking to my friend, my brother, my wife. And somehow, after days and weeks, I think we all came to the realization that we couldn't be those people. We couldn't live in fear. We couldn't raise our kids or be married to our wives in fear. We had to transcend. We had to live bigger lives. We had to make a legacy play, not a minor act. I remember Reb Kaplan, Mordechai Kaplan, said something beautiful. He said, religion should indicate to us some way whereby we can transform the evils of the world, if they're within our control, and transcend them if they're beyond our control. Transcend them. Think about what it is to live with fears but not be consumed by them. Think about what it is to take those moments of an illness or someone else's illness, of a loss or an impending loss, of a loss in our hearts or in our wallets or in our lives, and realize that that can't define us unless we allow it to define us. That we live in a world in which every day you're going to click on a phone or open a paper or read a television story or see the graphic images of fear in our world, and we have the choice not to ignore them, to do what we can with one hand and with the other to vanquish them and transcend them. It's walking out of a hospital and then back in and realizing that we're still walking. It's realizing that we're not alone in this world. It's coming to those points of realization that life matters more than the contents of our hearts in those moments. That what fear does is it allows us the opportunity, if we take it, to shrink, to live smaller than God deemed necessary, not to realize our potential. And what a tragedy it is on any given day to reduce ourselves and retract ourselves from the potential that God wrote into that day. If God gave you a blank piece of paper that is tomorrow, then you damn well better write it. That's our task. It's to look at this book of life that we read about early in the story in this Siddur tonight and say, if we and God are the authors of our lives, and if God gives us blank pages, we have to see them as opportunities to write extraordinary stories, to inspire others who read our stories as we live them, to see children, our own and other people's children, as people who are reading our story and learning what it is to be defied by fear or to defy it. To live in a world with fear but not to be fearful. To transcend. Walt Whitman said something so beautiful. He said, there was never any more inception than there is now, nor any more youth or age than there is now, and will never be any more perfection than there is now, nor any more heaven or hell than there is now. Now, that's the gift. That's the treasure. What gives us the temerity, the gall, the arrogance to think that we understand the future, let alone the present? What gives us the temerity to think about tomorrow when we have the opportunity to live in today? It's not to live in denial, it's to have our eyes wide open, but wider than they might be if we allow the penny of fear to block out the whole sun. It's realizing that every one of us has a story to make enriched and extraordinary in every day of life. That we came in here with a purpose not merely to pray for others, but to pray and realize what it is to pray for our world and be active in it. You'll hear tomorrow morning ways, opportunities. Hopefully in the story of this high holiday of Yom Kippur, you'll realize that with one hand you have the obligation to act, and with the other you have the obligation to move forward, to grab and grasp what God and life have given you. Whitman said those beautiful words in the same poem. A child said, "What is grass?" Fetching it to me with full hands. How could I answer the child? I do not know what it is any more than he. And yet how much of our life is consumed with what if? I remember weeks ago, maybe a few months ago, I sent you an email, and someone said to me she has it above her computer because she's a worrier. Well, I think we're all inclined to be worriers. Maybe it comes in our genetic makeup. And it was based on something that I heard over and over again as a child in these cassettes that my parents bought that we played on long and short trips with the sonorous voice that many of you know of Earl Nightingale. And Earl Nightingale probably had a big impact on who I was as a resistant kid in the car listening to those, thinking, why do I have to hear this old man's wisdom? But his wisdom maybe means something because I'm becoming an old man, or maybe it means something because I'm realizing it's wisdom. And what he said was the majority of the things that we worry about, the vast majority, will never happen, so why worry? And of what's left, the majority of that we have no control over, so why worry? So then only the tiniest fragment of that imaginary or vivid pie chart is worthy of our worry. But do we give it that little worry, that little of our soul and cell's energy? Or do we dedicate our lives to the worry of what might be and vanquish today in favor of the possibility of the fear of tomorrow? What did the psalmist say in the 23rd Psalm? Ki gelech elech begeitz al mavet, lo ira ra, ki ata imadi. He said in the 23rd Psalm, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Tzal mavet. The rabbis have difficulty describing, translating accurately those words. Tzal mavet. Tzel is shadow or shade, but the shadow of death? And maybe what the rabbis were teaching us, what the psalmist realized 2,100 years ago, was we can walk through the valley of the shadow, but we can't live there. We have an obligation to do what the verb says, which is to walk, not to build our houses in the valley of the shadow of death. And every day we look out into the world and we realize the stars and the clouds and the clear blue sky. And we decide whether we'll stand under the cloud and look for the sun or stand under the sun and realize the clouds. Every day in our lives we have this incredible gift of a mind, and the mind, not a brain, is bigger than that. And that has the ability to choose the day that we'll have and what we allow to consume it and what we allow to consume us. There's a psalm that said traditionally at this time of the year, the psalmist writes, whom shall I fear? The eternal is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When the wicked, my oppressors and my enemies come upon me to devour my flesh, they stumble and fall. Though a host should encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war should rise against me, even then I will be confident. Think back to what the pastor said at the beginning of the evening. Think back to that image of place God in the line and realize you can bring that wall crumbling down. And ask yourself, as he asks his congregation, not what are the walls in the ancient city of Jericho, why are they down? But what are the walls in our lives that we're allowing to remain standing because we're not willing to blow the trumpets and vanquish them? Because we have this vain belief that we're alone in our strife and in our struggle. What we realize tonight is that we're not alone. What we realize in our tradition, if we say Adonai and I, when we say these words of prayer, is the realization that our people have had for centuries and generations since the beginning of peoplehood. And it was that God makes this journey with us, and therefore every day and every step is unique and holy. And that the only time we hide from God in isolation is when we only find ourselves. And God taps on that door of the teenage girl or the elderly woman and says, open the door and realize that you aren't alone. But you have to come out and realize what I placed in your world. It was people. It was beauty. It was a world as dangerous and dark as it is in places, as gorgeous and illuminated as it is in others. Come into that world and pray and realize the blessings of a given day. Realize gratitude when you wake up in the morning, and as the book said earlier, 100 times in a given day, thank God and thank God and thank God and thank God. And in the moment when you forget to thank God and you lose your gratitude, when that recedes because fears allow you to stumble, they bring a blanket, a cloud over the sun, then again the tradition says, Baruch Ata Adonai. Thank God, because again, it'll remind you not only of what you have, but with whom you are. I look to you and I realize that I said to you a week ago that there was a social study done that matters. And what it said was that people who stand looking at a geographic slope alone have a different perception of it than people who stand even with a stranger next to them. It's not me. It's science. Think about that. Actual, realized, fixed nature. If you stand in this study, and that means in our lives, if you stand alone, you realize, you appreciate, you expect, you see a physical slope as being more daunting, more dangerous, more perilous than you would even if a stranger stood next to you. Subjects in the study, it says, did mathematical tests. That already makes my heart beat a little faster. And it says that the study states cardiac stress reaction created by challenging mental arithmetic tasks is found to be smaller when a person is accompanied by a supportive other than when alone. It didn't help me in math. There were always kids at the other tables. But I realized it can help me in life. What they're saying is social support matters. Think about your own life. Think about the moments when you're alone and the moments when you aren't. Think about what it is to realize resonance. And resonance comes when other bodies are with us. When other people are reverberating around us and realizing themselves as we realize ourselves, and realizing their frailties and their vulnerabilities and their struggles and their challenges just in our eyes as we do the same in theirs. This is social support. And the slope is life in the new year. There will be difficulties, there will be challenges, there will be pains, and we'll choose if to do it alone or if to go it together. I received an email, a letter in fact, not an email, an old-fashioned letter. I should frame it not only for its content, but because it's a letter. And it's from a woman who is here tonight. And she said that in 85 years, she'd never come to synagogue alone. And this Rosh Hashanah, she came alone. She said for 65 years, as I know, she was married. And before that, she always went with her parents. So 85 years, she always went to synagogue with others, with loved ones. She never sat alone. And this Rosh Hashanah, she decided to come. And she sat around strangers. And she said there was a certain moment when I said something about the Ashkenazic realization we have now, that Ashkenazic Jews all come from a genetic pool now. I said 600. They said 395 original Ashkenazic Jews. All of us are related, therefore. We're 30th cousins. Remember me in your will. But what she said was, at that moment, a woman, a stranger next to her, just tapped her on her shoulder. And she said other people during the service and after the service who were sitting next to her introduced themselves to her and hugged her and shared the holiday with her. And the next day she came back and she said, I went to sit again alone in the same seat with strangers, but there were no strangers. She met people whom she now knew, who cared about her because they showed it. And she said at the end of her letter to me that she realized that the year ahead, this first year without her beloved husband of 65 years, would be difficult. But she said this synagogue, this community, she realized, would help her through it. That's transcendence. That's power. That's a tap on a shoulder. That's standing together and swaying in Avinu Malkeinu. That, in 2 weeks, is opening a Torah and every one of us holding our hands on it. It's not experiential education alone. It's the experience of community. It's realizing us and ours, a history, a past, and a present that matters. Building the future one choice at a time, but not alone. At the end of this holiday and at its beginning, we hear this strangely formed and strangely sounding instrument called a shofar. It's not a beautiful flugelhorn or a saxophone. It's a ram's horn. And the first cry we know is tekiah. And the last cry is tekiah. You'll hear that tomorrow at the end of Havdalah. It'll be the last thing you hear. And think about its significance tomorrow. Because what's in the middle are fragmented and fragile. Truah is a call, a cry, a wail. And shvarim is broken like someone panting. Maimonides says these are the cries of someone with something heavy on their heart. It might be fear of what might be. It's walking across Reb Nachman's bridge, realizing it's teetering and that we're alone in that moment. It's realizing that as we take one step forward and then the next, we realize we're not alone. And then ultimately we cross that bridge with the confidence that comes in that final Tekiah Gedolah, which is transcendence, which is chesed, which is compassion, which is community, which is religion, which is connectedness, and which is the ultimate belief that we don't stand in a single moment only for ourselves, and that we don't walk forward a single step only by ourselves. So as you hear the shofar blown at the end of this holiday, ask yourself if you're ready to let go of some of those fears. Blow them away in the sound of that cry. In shvarim and truah, if you need to weep, then wail. But when you come to your intake of breath before Tekiah, that last gedolah, that last large resounding sound that you want to hear in your head, not only when you go to the parking lot, but at those times in the year when fear rears its head again and opens a window to your heart and soul, then again say Tekiah. Kol haolam kulo gesher tzar me'od. All the world, yes. It is a narrow bridge. V'haikar lo lefached klal. And the essence and the imperative is not to ever let fear become all. Gmar Chatima Tova.